Many announcements from Apple today. We have a new iPad, we have a new watch, and we have two new phones, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. So we now have iPhone 11, and for the first time, a Pro designation with the iPhone 11 Pro. And I have to say, in the history of Apple, I don't recall a phone that was leaked as much as the iPhone 11 was this year, mainly because we knew what the layout was going to be with this interesting new design with a triple camera setup, which is something we've needed for a long time. Now, a lot of the online tech reviewers have already been saying this is an incremental update, and I would agree with that in some respects. I think the last two phones have been excellent, the iPhone 10 and the iPhone 10s, and now we have the iPhone 11, which still has the notch. It still has really good but similar performance specs. We do have some differences, but I think from a photography standpoint, if you're into stills, if you're into shooting video, I don't think this is an incremental update at all. I think it's a pretty major update from Apple and one that we've needed to see for a while now. So what is new exactly? Well, in the iPhone 11, which is the slightly smaller and less expensive model, we have the dual camera setup, but this has actually changed in this model. In the past, with a dual camera setup, Apple has used the standard wide-angle lens in addition to a portrait focal length lens, and now they've flipped that around. So now we have the standard wide still, but now we have an ultra wide angle lens. You can still take portraits with it, but it's going to use a digital zoom as opposed to an optical zoom by using a physical lens. So this is kind of an interesting change. A lot of people have wanted to see an ultra wide angle lens, myself included. There are some phones now that implement an ultra wide lens, usually in the context of a triple camera setup. Now, we've seen ultra wide angle lenses on phones before. I don't think we've seen an implementation of this yet that's knocked it clear out of the park, and there is a challenge that comes with an ultra wide angle lens. Mainly that is the physical constraints you have with the optics. Now, for instance, Apple billed this as a 13mm f2.4 lens, which actually that's the 35mm equivalent on the focal length. The true focal length on this lens is probably just a couple millimeters. It's because the sensor's so small, the optics have to be so small, and so you're going to run into problems with distortion. It wants to fisheye. You're going to have heavy vignetting issues. Even getting shadow detail with an f2.4 lens indoors is going to require higher ISO settings and a lot of post-processing in camera to make this work. Now, will Apple be able to do this? I haven't used the phone yet. It is not out yet, but the examples they showed in the keynote do look very promising, and they're some of the best examples I've seen. Now, I don't know how much post-processing was done for the keynote. It would be interesting to see how this actually works in a real-life situation. And then we have the star of the show today, which is the iPhone 11 Pro. Now, this phone does use a triple camera setup, so you have all three lenses here. There is an ultra wide angle, a standard wide angle, as well as a portrait. They call it a telephoto, even though it's really kind of a 52mm equivalent, but it is a little bit longer lens. I think this is a very promising system. All three cameras on the front, in addition to the selfie camera, now have 12 megapixel sensors. They are capable of 4K video at 24p, 30p, and 60p, and the video results on this camera look really promising from the examples they've shown. And yes, there is now a new thing called slowfies. Hard to unsee that. But fortunately, Apple has stepped up in an area that I think has kept them behind the curve with Google and what they've done with the Pixel phones, and that is what they're doing with computational imaging. Now, they have had computational imaging before. I just don't think it's as mature a system as what we've seen with Google, particularly with Night Sight. And now, of course, over on the Apple side, we now have a night mode, which does a similar thing. What it's going to do is take a series of exposures. It's going to blend them together to find basically a complex way of doing an HDR image, but with less severe of an effect, hopefully, and it's going to allow you to take low light images that look really good. There is another layer of computational imaging that Apple previewed in this keynote. It won't be available at the phone's launch, but it will be coming in a software update sometime this year. This is called Deep Fusion, which is also an HDR principle related computational thing. I'm not really sure exactly what they're doing on it, but it's going to allow you to even out lighting and bring out the best detail and get sharper and clearer images. So without much more than the one example they showed, it's going to be interesting to see this in real life use. Which brings me to a question that I have about iPhone 11, mainly with the native camera app, and that deals with RAW file support. Now, as a photographer, I'm pretty picky about the files that I'm working with. I like to just get a quick JPEG, but I also like to be able to save a DNG copy of the file. You do this pretty easily on most Android phones, and I figure, well, if it's just writing a file and I've got room on my phone to do it, that's how I want to photograph everything. That way, if I have something that I like that works, but it needs a slight bit of shadow recovery or highlight recovery, recovery. Generally, with a RAW file, I'm able to do that. With a JPEG, I don't, because you're limited in the data that it writes in the end. It's just a much smaller file, JPEG or HEIC, whichever you're shooting on. So I'm not sure how Apple are going to address this, but with a triple camera setup on some of the Android phones, it is such that you can only get a RAW file in a Pro mode, which only gives you the standard wide-angle lens. So 2 of those cameras are not able to actually write RAW files. And you have to remember, there are 3 different sensors in a triple camera setup. So you have 3 lenses, each one has a sensor, but the software treats it as 1 camera. So my hunch is that Apple will probably treat this just like they did with the dual camera setup, where you have the ability to get RAW files, but you can't do it from the native app. It's opened up to third-party apps, things like the VSCO app or even Adobe Lightroom if you want to make DNG files from there. And unfortunately, those apps generally don't give you access to all 3 lenses, just the middle or the standard wide-angle lens. So I have the feeling that's how they're going to do it. I think the best implementation that I've seen on any phone to date is actually on the Google Pixel 3. And what Google have done with their software in that is a lot of the computational imaging is done pre-RAW. So it will use that computational imaging before it writes the RAW file. And I think the most amazing thing about the Google Pixel is they do all this with 1 lens at 1 focal length, and they just are knocking it out of the park right now. But it is nice to see Apple stepping up this side of imaging. It'd be interesting to see where this goes. So as a phone, it's probably more of an incremental update for Apple, although that's not an insult because I think the last 3 iPhones have been just unbelievably good. But I think if you're into still photography and video, I think this is a major update to the phone. I would love to hear from you. Leave me a comment below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.